The American Civil War was a very American conflict that split the country in two, a northern United States and a southern Confederate States doing battle over the future of what that nation or nations would look like. But it wasn't only Americans involved in this conflict. Many people from overseas and from groups that didn't identify with either the North or the South were in some ways involved. And today I'd like to talk about the northern borders of the United States. That is Canada. Well, technically Canada wasn't its own country at that point. It was very much still a British colony. I should say colonies because Canada had not yet been federated. That would happen after the Civil War. But nonetheless, I'd like to look at the role that the northern neighbor of the United States played during this conflict. Now, of course, it was a northern neighbor because the 1775 attempt by the Americans to take over Canada was beaten back by the Canadian militia, and Canada had also, for the most part, stayed loyal to the British during the War of 1812, which was why it was still a collection of British colonies during the time of the American Civil War. Now, by the time of this conflict, therefore, Canada's main policy towards the Civil War was dictated on the basis of the British policy too. And that basis, as exemplified by Queen Victoria, stated that Britain would remain neutral throughout this conflict. However, this neutrality would be tested at certain flashpoints, and the hottest that these would blaze would be in Canada itself. In 1861, as a result of Confederate diplomats being sent to the United Kingdom, the Trent Affair was when the RMS Trent, a mail ship sent by the British, was intercepted by the USS Jacinto, and 2 Confederate diplomats were taken from this British ship after it was fired on and ordered to stop by the American warship. The capture of these 2 diplomats was a breach of international law and was widely condemned throughout Europe based on the Americans' actions. It was thought by some that this breach of international law would be enough to get the British involved on the side of the Confederates. Indeed, the London Chronicle, a London newspaper, wrote, "Mr. Seward, the American Secretary of State, is exerting himself to provoke a quarrel with all Europe, in that spirit of senseless egotism which induces the Americans, with their dwarf fleet and shapeless mass of incoherent squads which they call an army, to fancy themselves the equal of France by land and Great Britain by sea, with just a hint of European snobbery." In any case, the British prepared to send immediately 14,000 troops to Canada, with a further 30,000 following them. In Canada itself, they also decided to increase the number of the militia to around 40,000 in order to protect the border in case of an American incursion should the tension continue to ratchet up. However, it's thought that the Canadian militia was in a pretty poor state, as is described by Kenneth Bourne. In spite of its proud record, or perhaps because of it, the Canadian militia had been allowed to decline into a mere paper force. By law, the entire male population between 18 and 60 was liable for service, but the vast majority of these, the sedentary militia, had no existence beyond enrollment. The only active force, the volunteers, received a mere 6 or 12 days annual training according to the arm of the service, and of the 5,000 authorized, there were only some 4,422 in June 1861, a miserable small force, and many of them but ill-trained, unless greatly improved since last year, was Newcastle's comment. Canada didn't seem too prepared then to face the might of the Union's assembling army in the north of the United States, and it was expected that if the Union were to invade Canada, they would send anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 regulars to complete the task. As Bourne goes on to write, the defense of Canada would be a very difficult task. The vast length of the exposed frontier made it virtually impossible for the British to defend it in its entirety. But worse, the Americans were peculiarly well placed to attack it. They not only had superior local resources in men and material, they also had excellent communications for concentrating those resources upon the frontier and for reinforcing them from the heart of commercial and industrial America. In fact, sufficiently good communications in McDougall's view to outweigh the difficulties of a winter campaign. In the end, however, the Trent Affair would not lead to war between the British and the Americans. Lincoln quoted as saying, "one war at a time," so they could focus their efforts on the South, and in the end, the matter was resolved. However, that wouldn't be the final time that Canada would become embroiled because of the British. On the whole, however, it seems that the Canadian population was largely pro-Union and was abolitionist, anti-slavery, thus agreeing with one of the main war aims of the United States following 1863. Slavery had already been outlawed throughout the Canadian provinces, and indeed Canada marked as the final stop on the Underground Railroad of escaped slaves coming from the South and making a new home in Canada. It therefore isn't a surprise that anywhere between 33,000 and 50,000 Canadians, or British North Americans to use the correct term for back then, signed up to fight for the Union. Among them there were some 2,500 free men of colour, many of whose ancestors had escaped from the South or themselves had done so previously. One prominent example was Anderson Ruffin Abbott, whose ancestors had escaped from Alabama and was a free man of colour living in Toronto in Canada, who enlisted for service as a surgeon in the United States Army, but because of prejudice wasn't able to make the position, even though he was a fully qualified physician, the first black physician in Canadian history. Instead, he would serve in a Washington hospital and received several commendations for his war service, becoming quite a popular figure within Washington society, even right the way to the top, becoming an acquaintance of President Lincoln himself. Another prominent Canadian individual from the French-Canadian community, Calixa Lavallée, was important because as a musician he had moved to the United States in 1857 and at the outbreak of the war joined the 4th Rhode Island Infantry Regiment as part of their musical corps. Now it's for after the Civil War that he's remembered, as in 1880 he wrote the melody for a song that in 1980 would be used to put the national anthem of Canada, O Canada, to this melody, and so he should be remembered as well. Another prominent Canadian was Sarah Emma Edmonds, who joined up with the 2nd Michigan Infantry Regiment. According to her autobiography, she was a spy that was important in getting new information on the Confederates for the Union, although the only source of evidence for this is her autobiography, so we should maybe be a little skeptical of that. However, there was also a lot of Confederate sympathy in the North, and indeed Confederate agents. As is written about by Kevin Plummer in The Torontoist in 2011, Southern agents operated freely and openly with little to no concern from local authorities who were governed by British North America's official policy of neutrality. Indeed, Southerners enjoyed the sympathy of most of Toronto's political, social, and business elite, although few were as enthusiastic in supporting the Confederate cause as George Taylor Denison III, member of a prominent Toronto family and a practicing lawyer who would go on to have a career both in politics and in the military. Norman Knowles, in his biography of Taylor Denison, writes that his identification with the South came naturally. It represented an idyllic society that embodied the social order, conservative values, and chivalric traditions he wished to see maintained in British North America. He drew parallels between his loyalist ancestors, who had fought to uphold their principles against the demagoguery of American patriots, and the Southerners, who were struggling to preserve their identity and way of life. The Confederates then used Canada as a base for spying on the North, particularly the Maritimes, those provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island for base of several covert operations. Some 20,000 men from the Maritimes would enlist, largely in the Northern Army, but there were several examples, possibly even in the low hundreds, of those going over to fight for the Confederates too. In particular, the city of Halifax, with its prominent port, was very important to the Confederates. Indeed, one of their largest supporters here was Benjamin Weir, a prominent merchant who would, after the Civil War, go on to become governor of Nova Scotia for around a year. It was said that outside of his company's office, he flew the Confederate stars and bars in solidarity with the South. He used Halifax as a base for Confederate blockade runners who were attempting to escape the Union's blockade to bring in arms and supplies for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. In return, he received cotton, of course, got at the very hard labour of slaves in the South, and which he would then trade on with Britain at very high prices. We know that the Americans were aware of Halifax's position. As Seward noted in 1865, Halifax is a postal dispatch station in the correspondence between the rebels at Richmond and their emissaries in Europe. Halifax merchants are known to have surreptitiously imported provisions, arms, and ammunition from our seaports and then transshipped them to the rebels. The governor of Nova Scotia has been neutral, just and friendly, so were the judges of the province who presided on the trial of the Chesapeake. But then it is understood that on the other hand, merchant shippers of Halifax and many of the people of Halifax are willing agents and abettors of the enemies of the United States, and their hostility has proved not merely offensive, but deeply injurious. The trial of the Chesapeake being mentioned here is also referred to as the Chesapeake Affair, and the name Chesapeake comes from the USS Chesapeake, a United States ship that was captured in 1863 by several Canadian citizens from Halifax who were loyal to the Confederacy and who wanted to make it into a Confederate blockade runner, so basically a ship that would bring supplies into Confederate hands going around the Union blockade. However, after they stole the ship and killed one of the men on board, the USS Malvern and USS Dakota followed it in hot pursuit, and in Nova Scotia caught up with it and took back control of the ship. American newspapers were incensed, one writing, "The recent shipment of 1,000 rifles by pro-Confederate British sympathizers from New York to Halifax in violation of military regulations, the recently discovered plans of Confederate pirates at Halifax to capture other American steamers between New York and Halifax, the plans of neutral passengers to carry forbidden and treasonable mails to the insurgents, and the plans of neutral merchants to carry war supplies." And then, when those men who had gone on to capture the USS Chesapeake were interned in Canada by Canadian armed forces, it's thought that William Johnson Almon, a prominent citizen, was actually involved in busting them out of jail. It's also true that following the end of the American Civil War, around 30 prominent Confederates would choose to make Halifax their home, thus cementing the links that had been established throughout the war there. In 1864, perhaps the most serious event would occur that might have led Canada into the American Civil War, and that was a raid in St. Albans, Vermont, by several Confederate troops who had made their way north of the border and from Canada launched these raids into American Union territory by trying to raid several banks and making away with a large sum of money. Some historians have put this as high as $170,000 from several banks. Others have interpreted the figure as being somewhat lower. But in any case, these Confederates managed to take a large sum of money, kill several Union soldiers, and then escape north of the border, where they were promptly captured and held by Canadian militia. The reason this became an international affair was because Union troops followed them north of the border, thus in violation of Canadian neutrality, although technically also those coming south from the border were also violating Canadian neutrality by using it as a base of attack on another party. However, by 1864, it seemed very unlikely that Britain was going to join the American Civil War in support of the South, and so once again, this did not lead to war. In general, the period of the American Civil War seems to have been quite profitable for many people in Canada. We've already talked about those Haligonian traders coming out of Halifax and blockade running, as well as in general for Canadian agriculture, given that their grain was in very high supply in the north. In 1865, Canadians would be involved at the very last shots of the American Civil War, when one Canadian captain, Edward P. Doherty, would be in charge of an important group of men. He had already signed up in 1861 and had fought at the first real battle of the American Civil War at Bull Run, after which in the chaotic retreat he had been captured but later managed to escape. But while Doherty and many other Canadians were fighting for the North, John Wilkes Booth had visited Canada, Montreal, another seat, a hotbed of Confederate activity, and planned to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, which he subsequently did. However, it would be Doherty who would lead the troop of men that eventually tracked down and killed John Wilkes Booth on a Virginia farm. In 1866, Canada would again feel some of the after effects of the American Civil War, when many of those Irishmen who had fought for the North would join the Fenian Brotherhood, who would lead raids into Canada from the northern USA, these raids becoming known as the Fenian Raids. If you're interested in this, I think it'd be a super interesting video that I could make in the future, as I've already made a video about the Irish in the American Civil War and the role it had in Canada. Ultimately, these were meant to persuade the British to leave Ireland, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. The Canadians complained that the United States wasn't doing enough to shore up their side of the border, but the Americans could quite fairly respond that the Canadians had been in league with the Confederates over a large part of the American Civil War and hadn't really extradited many of those responsible for piratical and other attacks on the United States to the Americans. And so there was somewhat of a standoff following the American Civil War, with a severely cooled set of relations between the two nations. This in no small part led to the 1867 Federation of Canada, where all of these separate provinces would be brought together, or I should say separate colonies were brought together into provinces of one unified Canada that was being ruled. So that's the story of Canada and the Canadians in the American Civil War. Let me know in the comments below, did you know anything about the role of Canadians in the American Civil War and where their allegiances lay? Would you be interested in seeing further videos, perhaps one about that relationship between the British, the Americans, and the Confederates in that period, and the choices that the British made, with sometimes it being suggested that the British were quite close to getting involved on one side or the other, probably on the southern side, and why ultimately that did not happen? If you are, let me know in the comments below, as I'd be keen to make more videos on this topic, as I personally find it very interesting. And if you want to see what nations other immigrants got up to during this period of the American Civil War, let me know in the comments below. I always like to read interesting facts and stories that people come up with, and always good to get more ideas for future videos. So thank you so much for watching. In the meantime, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History